Natural selection, the process by which evolution can produce a better organism. So in this lecture, I would like you to be able to define natural selection and artificial selection, and be able to tell which is which for any given example. It's pretty simple. Is an intelligent organism involved? It's probably artificial selection. List the postulates of evolution by natural selection. This is pretty important. And give examples of natural and artificial selection. So, selection. The idea that not all organisms are going to survive. You can see this pretty easily in a garden. You can see this pretty easily in a pond. You can see this whenever there is predation, or whenever some plant is thrown into the compost heap of history, and offspring of a different, better plant are going to be put in the garden next year. These are natural and artificial selection. As you see here, we have a heron eating a mouse. This is natural selection. The heron chose the mouse that was easiest to prey upon. So not all organisms are going to survive, and that mouse is not going to leave any offspring, so something in its alleles is not going to get passed on. Those mice that are better at hiding are going to possess the traits that are suited to their environment, in this case, avoiding predation. Now, selection can be natural, sexual, or artificial. So natural selection is often done by predators on prey or by the environment on the organism. Artificial selection is done by humans or other intelligent creatures on something that they want to get a certain trait out of. Sexual selection is more complicated, and oh boy, will we spend plenty of time on that later. Let's start off with artificial selection as an example. Pretty easy one to grasp, given that humans do it and we are humans. Artificial selection was the goal for making a better tomato. So it's directed selection by an intelligent force. Direction, that's kind of the important thing here. So we have here two tomatoes. Solanum pimpinellifolium is a natural tomato and probably one of the more recent common ancestors of the actual tomato that we eat, which is Solanum lycopersicum. There's another one, I can't remember the name offhand, but I do remember that it is related to Solanum pimpinellifolium. It's just a slightly bigger berry. Now, what we wanted as humans was the biggest, reddest berry, so we chose certain tomatoes that will survive and reproduce, and those ones are going to be the ones that are most adapted to our desires. So the tomato that is slightly bigger, we take some of those fruit and we don't eat them, we plant their seeds. So tomatoes in nature are relatively small. They're supposed to be eaten by birds, and birds are relatively small compared to humans. The modern tomato that we have are very large. They're also very red because we want that red coloration. And they're also very tasteless. Let's face it. Unless it's vine ripened and you pick it directly from the farm or buy it from a farmer's market, you're just eating gross cardboard. Anyway, I'm a big fan of farmer's market tomatoes, and I've had Solanum pimpinellifolium. Those are tomatoes that are very, they got a lot of flavor. Oh, and here we have it's the cheese manii. Cheese manii is the most recent ancestor from Solanum lycopersicum. So that's the one we chose to create a larger tomato. So the larger tomatoes can be bred by a couple different ways. There's what's called introgression lines, and that's when you're actually going to see a trait. Say that you see an insect resistance trait in Solanum pimpinellifolium or Chilense or something, and you breed your tomato, your beefsteak tomato, this large red one, you breed it with Solanum pimpinellifolium, and you get a hybrid. You take that hybrid, cross it back to lycopersicum until you have a full lycopersicum genome except for the one gene from pimpinellifolium for insect resistance or whatnot. So that's an introgression line. And we'll cover this a little more later because they're incredibly complicated but really good genomics in natural and artificial selection. Another type of artificial selection is just getting the biggest one and replanting the biggest one and getting the biggest one from those offspring and planting the biggest one. That's what we usually do. And a third way for artificial selection is genetically modifying the organism, where you just take the gene and you just jam it into the genome, and now you have a brand new organism. So there are a couple different ways for natural selection, but whatever it is, it's going to be for the traits. So we're selecting on the traits. artificial and natural selection is on the traits that the organisms have. And realistically, when you're selecting for a certain trait, larger tomato, better insect resistance, you're really selecting for an allele. So the alleles here, we have something called fruit weight 2.2. Now you have two tomatoes here and they look kind of the same to you. Okay, hold on, that's fruitist. But fruit weight 2.2 is a gene. There is an allele of fruit weight 2.2 that'll actually cause a larger number of cells during early fruit development. So the way tomatoes develop is they have a phase during which they undergo a lot of mitosis and make a lot of new cells. Then they have a phase during which they fill those cells up and the cells get larger. Then that's your large green tomato. And then they wait for a certain signal, usually ethylene, and then during that time they're going to ripen. So there's cell number, cell growth, and ripening. So you have different parts of the fruit development process. Fruit weight 2.2 is going to actually cause a higher number of cells during mitosis. And that's going to result in those cells expanding more, and there's going to be more expansion because there are more cells, so you get a bigger fruit. And you can see this manipulated and unmanipulated. With a wild allele, fruit weight 2.2, it gets smaller. And you may see it looks a little more concentrated red. That's just the lighting there. But the fruit weight 2.2 is basically a tomato that is half the size, volume-wise. So you pick the one allele and you get a much bigger tomato. And that's how natural selection can pick for a certain allele over another one. Can it cause speciation? Well, that's a good question. And we're going to come back to that when we talk about artificial and natural selection. You see, Brassica oleracea is this wild mustard, wild cabbage-like thing. If you select for bigger stems, you get kohlrabi. I don't know what you do with it in that case. It's never really a good food. If you select for bigger leaves, you get cabbage. If you select for more dense flower clusters, you're going to get broccoli. Select for more artificial, shortened lateral buds, you get Brussels sprouts. If you select for bigger leaves, you're going to get kale. And either way, you're going to get something your kids won't eat. But artificial selection may or may not make new species. Like, is Brussels sprouts a different species than cabbage? Well, no. They're different cultivated varieties. But if they breed, you have this short bud and these lateral buds. What will the offspring of those two look like? Is it going to be the same as either? No. It's going to look like something different. So from the morphological species concept, you could actually make an argument you have new species. But from the biological species concept, what we use, you don't. But what if we did something to change how they breed? Well, then by the biological species concept, yes, artificial selection could cause speciation. And that's a good question because we're going to come back to how natural selection causes speciation in many later lectures. All right, the postulates of evolution. You got to know these. These are good stuff. I'm actually going to make more room for them on this little board so I can write them a little larger. Of course, you're going to see me type them up, so I don't quite know the point of that. Comfort. So the postulates, what are the things we're looking for microevolution to happen? And we're going to look at microevolution. Speciation is a pretty simple postulate. At some point they can interbreed, and then later they can't. That's a new species, biologically. So evolution by natural selection, specifically microevolution, requires that first the organisms have some sort of variation. All your tomatoes are the same size? Not interesting. One of your tomatoes has an allele that makes it twice as large? Well, there's your variation. It's an allele. It's genetic. That means the variation is heritable. And I know we talked earlier about heritability, variability, and differential survival and reproduction. Well, same thing, really. So that's the next, of course. So you got the variation, you got a big fruit. It's an allele, so it's heritable. And now that one's going to have a higher level of survival and reproduction. So differential survival and reproduction. Which means that plant gets replanted more often, or a bird is going to eat the larger fruit and poop out more seeds farther away. And last, the reproduction is non-random. This is tricky. So if you have a fruit with a plant with a larger fruit, but it breeds with so many plants with smaller fruits that all of its offspring have, are just heterozygous, and that is effectively random, then you'll have occasionally randomly a certain number of large fruit and randomly a certain number of small fruit. And the allele frequency won't change unless large fruit breed more with large fruits. So you need non-random reproduction between certain individuals in order to actually move that allele frequency forward and make it more frequent. So we'll see this more and more with this reproduction being non-random. One great way that reproduction is non-random is if organisms die before reproducing. Then reproduction is among the survivors, which is not random. Okay, here's a lengthy crocodile example. So this is a good example of evolution, and let's kind of look through this. We're going to start with a hypothetical predator, and that's going to be some sort of crocodilian. And it's going to have variation. So there's variation in height. You've got some crocodiles are 5.9 feet tall, and other crocodiles are 6.8 feet tall. Why that big? We'll come back to that later. But let's say that the 5.9 feet are 25% of the population, 75% is the other phenotype. And there's large herbivores to eat. Competition is going to lead to proportional death. So some are going to die from each population. Individuals will mate randomly, and the offspring will inherit their parents' characteristics. New population is going to continue to resemble the first. This is going to lead to stasis, no change in the population structure or species form over many generations because there's, random mating and random inheriting. Okay, cool. Evolution is modification of a population as it descends from the parent population, though. So that's going to be descent with modification. So we can get an example here of some evolution moving forward. So let's look what happens if a new variation randomly arises in the offspring, a shorter crocodilian. It can either be a neutral variant, a disadvantageous variant, or an advantageous variant. We'll cover later another type of variant it can be, which is lethal, but since it exists in this population, we're implying it's not lethal, because it exists and didn't die at birth. What becomes the existing and new variation is going to depend on a whole bunch of different factors. So if it's negative, it dies out, and the disadvantageous variant doesn't continue, the allele never goes around. But what if it's neutral? Well, it can just drift. So over time, the new variant can, you don't have a new variant here, but the variation can just kind of drift. Eventually it can come to fixation in a limited population. So, given enough time, traits either become extinct or fixed. Given enough time. And in the large populations, that time can be way longer than is practical. But what if it's advantageous? What if a certain type of prey dies out? The dinosaurs, in this case, aren't present for the crocodilians to eat. Predators have to shift to a new food source, in this case, fish. So in that case, the shorter predators are better to acquire fish and more likely to survive and reproduce, causing differential survival and reproduction, which is needed for evolution. So microevolution, we see within a single generation, it goes from 25% to 33%. The shorter crocodiles do better. And over time, you'll fix that allele. So basically all of them are 5.9 feet. Without new variation, there's no evolution, because no variation, no evolution. Okay. And if death exceeds birth, you get extinction. Okay. No advantageous variants. Population dies out. So that's one possibility. But what if there is variability and a new random variation occurs? If it's a larger one, disadvantageous, goes away, try again. If it's a smaller one, though, positive selection is going to favor the smaller one. That's microevolution. Okay. If there's a larger one, again, it'll die out. But what if there's a smaller one? Again, advantageous. So, one by one, anytime a smaller one arises, which is random, this isn't a directional thing, it's just randomly, smaller ones may arise. If larger ones arise, they're disadvantageous, they die out. If smaller ones arise, they're advantageous, and they go to fixation. So eventually you get these very short alligators, crocodiles. So this is adaptation. So these organisms have higher fitness because this allele is better for the environment. So the natural selection is on this trait, which is height, and the allele, which is short height. But let's say we have two different populations, one of which is going to be hunting large herbivores and the other is hunting fish. Over time, there's natural selection for taller ones hunting the herbivores and shorter ones hunting the fish. So over time, you have two populations are going to be separating, descending with modification, and end up looking very different. Okay, you're looking at 9.5-foot crocodile, you're like, hold the phone. That doesn't exist. We'll come back to that. This repeated branching could form an evolutionary tree, and that's how you can get natural selection to make new species. Over this time, with two different populations under two different selective pressures, that results eventually in any hybrids that these were to form would have lower fitness and would be unable to eat fish or herbivores. So the hybrids have lower fitness, and there's an advantage to not mating with the other species. We'll come back to reproductive isolating mechanisms later, but suffice it to say, they're biologically distinct. So we do see this actually in crocodile macroevolution. We start with the thecodonts. They evolved into crocodilians, saurischians, birds, ornithischians, and pterosaurs. And the crocodilians existed all around the world, but now are mostly limited to the tropical areas where it's a little warmer and they can do more crocodile things because they don't like the cold and they don't like prairies or tundra. It's just not a good crocodile place. So you've got different varieties of crocodiles in Africa, coming from different phylogenetic trees, and in Asia and in America, including the American alligator. And here's your Postosuchus. Here's your big old crocodile. So those were huge. Postosuchus were these like 9-foot tall crocodiles. The thing is, they weren't as fast as dinosaurs. So, they weren't as good of predators as dinosaurs, so they ended up getting outcompeted. But you get this microevolution, which is your change in populations, and macroevolution, evolution of new species. And you do have crocodiles that eat fish in the water, and we used to have crocodiles that ate bigger herbivores on land, like Postosuchus. All right, so let's finish this off with what is fitness? This is a term you're going to see a lot. Fitness is a number of offspring. It's your individual's ability to produce offspring relative to others in the same population or species. So here we have, I think it's George Bush, right? George Bush and his family, he has a lot of offspring, and then we have the Clintons and their family, which has, one offspring, and the George Bush family got even larger. The Clinton family, does Chelsea Clinton even have a kid? I don't know. But yeah, fitness here is showing that the Bush lineage had a lot of offspring. They have higher fitness relative to others in the same population or species, and the Clintons had one kid, so low fitness relative to others in the same population or species. You can't compare between species. That's literally comparing apples and oranges. An adaptation is a trait that increases an organism's fitness relative to individuals lacking that trait. So if this increases fitness compared to others in the same population that don't have the same allele, it's called an adaptation. And we're really just going for a better than philosophy. So remember, evolution just goes for what is better than. So if we have a trait, it has to just be better than whatever else exists at the time. So this weird tree insect, it's just got a weird face. Well, whatever it is that adaptation gives can just cause this to be better than whatever it was earlier. So I guess predators don't recognize the face and can't prey on it. That's just better than the predators recognizing it. Okay. So how do we test for evolution? What are some experiments we can do? Let's look over. Any good scientific theory has to be testable. So do individuals vary in a population? Remember, variation. Is variation heritable? So heritability. Is reproduction variable? Differential survival and reproduction. And is reproduction non-random? So is it between individuals who have the same trait? Here we have a population of mice. Some are dark, some are light, some are in between. The predators, the cranes, prefer the darker ones, which is going to mean that the lighter ones are going to have a higher survival and reproduction, and they're going to reproduce with other lighter ones, which is non-random. An example here is bees and snapdragons. And we're looking here, this is going to give you nightmares, but we're looking at P and Q. Yep, allele trait, allele frequency. So we're looking at one population where the white ones are 75% of the population and the yellow ones are 25%. Well, certain ones are going to have more fitness than others. These white ones have a higher fitness. So what happens in the next generation is 77% are white and 23% are yellow. So that's going to be a slight change in allele frequencies. Was it significant? Well, there's something called the chi-square test we'll cover later that covers whether or not a change is significant. And yes, P's and Q's, you might want to start looking at Hardy-Weinberg. Yup, we're coming back to it. All right, here's one of the best tests of evolution done in our time, and that is the Peter and Rosemary Grant's work with finches. I'm going to kind of move through this quickly, but this book, The Beak of the Finch, covers it in a great level of detail, and your book covers it in a pretty good level of detail, and we're going to come back to it in an excellent level of detail, so I'm going to move through just the postulates here pretty quickly for time's sake. So they really looked at all finches on Daphne Major, which is right in the middle there of the Galapagos Islands. So they measured all the finch beaks in the population. They found out that individuals vary. Some had larger beaks, some had smaller beaks. They measured the beak depth with a pair of calipers, and they found the average beak depth was about 9.5 millimeters with a variation all the way from 6 to 14. It's a big one with that 14. This is a histogram of 751 finches showing variation. It's heritable. They figured out who the parents were, they tagged them, and they watched who the offspring were, and they found out that it was a heritable difference between the average of the two parents and the average of all the offspring. They found out this mid-offspring correlated well with mid-parents. So it's a heritable trait. Individuals vary in survival and reproduction. So we found the number of finches actually, there's a die-off over time between 1977 and 1978. There was a die-off of finches where not all finches survived. And what happened is the finches with the smaller beaks ended up surviving at a higher level. So you see the bigger beaks. The bigger beaks survived at a higher level. It's like, wait a sec. You see the average there moved from 9.5 to 10 millimeters depth. It's not a huge movement, but it is still a movement. There was non-random reproduction. And that meant there was that individuals reproduced non-randomly with one another because only the survivors could reproduce with each other. Okay? Really quick through. Read it in your book. They do a really good in-depth job. And we'll come back to those finches. So what are some limits to natural selection? Well, remember that natural selection is acting on individuals. The effects are seen in a population. It's something called the Darwin Awards. It's the idea that people eliminate themselves in the gene pool by doing something exceedingly stupid. And that individual eliminating themselves in the gene pool might make the genes pool smarter. If you take the what is it? We always had in my high school the students with the 3 students with the lowest grade wouldn't continue in the school. So we started it off with the largest group of freshmen ever, and we ended up with 24 seniors. So every year the students with the lowest grades were gone. So they didn't continue. So at the end, the average grade was me. I was the average student. That's how intelligent the students were. You can make your own judgments on that. But I was the average student because the population had shifted towards only the students who were getting A's. Natural selection will act on phenotypes, but evolution is going to measure changes in the allele frequencies, the genotypes. So we can't select on the gene, we have to select on the allele, on the phenotype, what we see in the individual. All right, some limits. Natural selection can only act on existing traits. We have a newt here. It's got ribs, newts do. It's actually a newt that has a very good healing ability, but it needs to be defended against predators. So what we have is a spotted newt. What it can do is it could secrete a poison. Well, it doesn't have that variability. Well, it could have camouflage. Well, it doesn't have that variability. Well, what if it just had easily breakable ribs? Well, it does have that variability. So this newt actually has breakable ribs, and it can heal quickly. So, okay. What's its defense on predators? If bitten, the ribs shatter and move, and the sharp, jagged edges come through the outside of the skin, impaling the predator's teeth, or impaling the predator's mouth. It seems like a horrible defense when you realize if the newt survives, and then it reproduces. So the newts of this species with breakable ribs that shatter and come through the outsides of the skin and jab the predators in the mouth, those are the newts that have a higher reproduction. That's the trait it had, and it selected on it. So it's a weird defense, but since it can't select for a poisonous newt, in this case, That's all it had. Evolution can only act on existing traits. It can't lead to perfect organisms. You're not perfect. Nobody's perfect. No perfection. Humans are full of faults. Download the slides and copy the images, and you can read them for yourselves. You can see how our eyes, for example, we have a blind spot because the nerves are installed backwards. Our heart has a tendency towards circuitous, tortuous turns in the arteries, which can cause heart attacks and eddies in your blood flow. Your knees, well, we can just say when you get older, you'll figure that out. In your neck, you have that the transition between trachea and esophagus can always get choked up. The brain has the visual cortex is installed in reverse order, and you have the visual back here, but the eye's up here. There's a lot of little things, little design flaws. It's not designed. It's just whatever we had was, what variation has, and what alleles are slightly better than, because there isn't a goal here. Evolution is not goal-oriented. The first fish that came out of the ocean didn't think someday there will be a terrestrial organism that walks on two legs. No, they just, if this fish can walk a little farther, it's a better fish and has more offspring. The primates that came down from the trees were not like, okay, so we need to get the alleles that'll allow for the organism to stand upright. No, they just, the ones that could get out of trees and could occasionally look up better and then go back down to walking on all fours and go to the next tree, those are the ones that survived. Natural selection doesn't have a goal. It's only selecting which organisms of the population are going to have the variation that is heritable, that are going to have a higher higher reproduction rate, higher fitness than the other ones. Whatever organisms are having the highest reproduction at that time are the ones most adapted to their environment. There's no goal, there's no perfection, and there are some really interesting kludges that are MacGyvered out of what can and cannot work based on the variation we have. Now we're going to have some fun, freaky examples later, but I want you to know the postulates and the limits to natural selection.